we're now in a global crisis and we need to be stronger, but we also need to be smarter. So we need the equipment and the skills to compete in an era of potentially war from satellites and from space, potentially the huge worries that we have about cyber security.
Move on to the front page of the Times this morning, and it's got the comments that have been made from Carlos del Toro. He's the US Secretary of the Navy. He says Britain needs to reassess the size of its armed forces in light of rising threats across the world. He's urging the UK to invest in the Royal Navy after we found out about those plans potentially to decommission ships to free up some sailors. Nikki, this has been one of several stories that have really been ramping up sort of in the last week and a half or so, talking about sort of Britain's military might. Do you think we need to reassess what our armed forces look like?
Yes, I think we do. And we've discussed on this panel, I think probably for a number of weeks now, different stories around, sort of geopolitical instability, the kind of dangerous world that we appear to be living in, the different conflicts. I was having a really interesting conversation earlier this week, and somebody who studies this was saying, we seem to have sort of, in many handling these conflicts, we're normalizing, or other people are normalizing conflict and response through weapons and use of their armed forces. And I think this is an important message from a very key ally. And I think that, I think it says in the Times, this is very unusual that somebody so senior in the US administration would say this publicly. And I'm assuming they've done so because they feel that they have not had any kind of response that they would want from the UK government or from Number 10. And so I think this is a warning. And I have to say, we're not perhaps going to touch on it this morning. We will, I guess, closer to the budget. But all this stuff about Jeremy Hunt and tax cuts and all the rest of it, frankly, I think we should just forget that. We're going to have to spend a lot more on military, on our warships and other parts of our armed forces over, I think, the next few years. And that's where, I think increased spending is going to have to go.
Jack, that the military sort of core will say our economy will be better rooted in having stronger defence. Do you think will the decision makers buy that argument?
Well, I think the problem is that there has been so much sort of spin and manipulation of numbers and claim and counterclaim around our armed forces over recent times, that when senior figures in the UK say things like, we don't need as many people because we're doing all these other things and modern warfare has changed, then the public and quite a lot of us involved in the debates don't quite believe that is true. I think there's a need for both. We need to be far less complacent about that axis of action against a global order with the rule of law and democracy and universal human rights that is Russia, Iran, and China, and the aggression that flows from that. I'm in the Philippines at the moment, and people here, politicians here probably talk about half the time about the aggression from China in the seas around the Philippines, and their worries for the future here, not just about Taiwan, but about themselves. And I think so we're now in a global crisis and we need to be stronger, but we also need to be smarter. So we need the equipment and the skills to compete in an era of potentially war from satellites and from space, potentially, the huge worries that we have about cyber security. And we can see in Ukraine, the use by both sides of drones, changing the nature of warfare, not involving aircraft that have personnel in them, but actually unmanned equipment that can easily fly over territory and cause carnage. So there's a combination of things needed here: rational decision making, a good balance of resources. But the one thing that's absolutely certain is we need more resources and we need them fast.
Yeah, Nikki, do you think we have been complacent? Because the counter argument that always comes up with this is, okay, funding, spending, channeling more money into the military when we've got, issues around cost of living. That's just always the next part of the debate where people say, look, let's look at the other stories we've been talking about today, people losing their businesses. There's always a negotiation to be had in where you spend the money. But, have we been complacent?
Well, I think Jack is right about the need for smart spending, and it's partly about personnel, but also about equipment. And there's no doubt that cyber warfare, for example, is changing the nature of conflict hugely. But I think probably, and I don't think it's just this government, I think just generally we have all taken for granted the fact that we felt like we were living in a much more stable world. And I think for a generation or two, that's probably been the case. I mean, of course, there have been individual conflicts, but they've been managed, they haven't spread. And I think that now we are having this debate about whether things are going to be contained, and also, of course, the impact of the potential, the US election, what that's going to mean for European security, particularly around Ukraine, how much the UK and the EU is going to have to pick up the burden of supporting Ukraine even more than they're already doing. And I think these are real questions, and I think that's what the senior military figures, both in the UK but also elsewhere, are just trying to get governments and ministers, exactly as you say, Rosie, which is, it's obviously easier to make spending decisions to affecting domestic spending. That is what's going to come up on the doorstep when you step out tomorrow morning, as the local MP or candidate and chat away to people. But ultimately, as Jack said, the security of the nation is the most critical thing that any government can do. And preparing for if there's insecurity is something I think people will expect their governments to be doing.
Well, precisely. Nikki, thank you so much. Jack, hold right there because we'll revisit some more topics in our panel coming up shortly.